The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on Adelaide Porter's back as she trudged the final steps toward the well, her throat so parched it felt like sandpaper. The summer of 1878 had brought the worst drought that Malad City, Idaho had seen in decades, turning the once fertile valley into a dust bowl that threatened to swallow every last hope the residents had managed to cling to. Adelaide's hands trembled as she grasped the rope of the community well, the wooden bucket feeling impossibly heavy in her calloused palms. At 22, she had already weathered more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. The death of her parents to influenza 3 years prior had left her to manage their struggling farm alone, with mounting debts and dwindling prospects haunting her every waking moment. "Just a little more," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the distant cries of cattle from neighboring ranches. The muscles in her arms screamed in protest as she began to turn the crank, drawing water from the depths below. She had been making this journey 3 times daily for the past week, ever since her own well had run dry, leaving her crops withering and her future uncertain. The world began to blur around the edges, the relentless heat and exhaustion finally claiming their toll. Adelaide felt her knees buckle beneath her worn cotton skirt, the wooden bucket slipping from her grasp as darkness crept into her vision. The last thing she remembered was the sound of hoofbeats approaching before consciousness abandoned her entirely. Miles Vance had not planned to stop at the community well that afternoon. The 30-year-old cowboy had been on his way back to the Broken Spur Ranch after delivering a message to the telegraph office in town when he spotted the lone figure collapse beside the well. Without hesitation, he urged his chestnut gelding forward, dust kicking up beneath the animal's hooves. Miss, can you hear me?" Miles called out as he dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the hard, packed earth. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her, gently turning her over. He recognized her immediately, Adelaide Porter, the young woman who had been struggling to keep her family's farm since her parents had passed. Miles had seen her in town occasionally, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. Many believed it was only a matter of time before the bank foreclosed on the Porter property. A woman alone couldn't manage such a place, they said. But there was something about the determination in her eyes that had always caught his attention, even if they had never exchanged more than a polite nod in passing. He removed his bandana and dipped it into the water bucket she had managed to fill partially before fainting. Gently, he pressed the cool cloth to her forehead, noting the flush of her cheeks from the heat. "Miss Porter, Adelaide," he tried again, concern etching his weathered features. Adelaide's eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding her hazel eyes as she tried to make sense of the face hovering above her. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking from dehydration. "Easy now," Miles said, helping her to sit up slowly. "You collapsed from the heat." "When's the last time you had something to drink yourself?" Adelaide's gaze drifted to the bucket. "The water's not for me," she murmured. "The crops need it more." Miles frowned, taking in her disheveled appearance, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the sunburn across her cheeks and nose, the trembling in her hands. "Your crops won't mean much if you're dead," he said bluntly, though his tone remained gentle. "Here, drink this." He offered her his canteen, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it, taking small, measured sips of the lukewarm water inside. "Thank you," she said, attempting to rise to her feet. "I should get back, there's still so much to do before sundown." Miles placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You're in no condition to be hauling water back to your farm. Where's your wagon?" Adelaide's gaze dropped to the ground. I had to sell the horse last month. I've been carrying the water." Miles felt something tighten in his chest. The Porter farm was nearly 3 miles from town. The thought of this young woman making that journey on foot, carrying heavy buckets of water in this heat, made his jaw clench with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That settles it," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "I'm taking you home and your water." Adelaide shook her head, a flash of pride crossing her face. "I don't need charity, Mr. Vance. It's not charity, Miss Porter, it's being a good neighbor." He filled the bucket completely and secured it with rope. "And please call me Miles." After a moment's consideration, Adelaide relented, allowing him to help her onto his horse. Miles mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins, the water bucket hanging securely from his saddle. The ride to the Porter farm was mostly silent, with Adelaide occasionally directing him when they reached a fork in the road. As they crested the final hill, the farmhouse came into view, a modest two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. The fields surrounding it were visibly struggling, the corn stalks yellowing and the vegetable garden wilting under the relentless sun. "It's not much," Adelaide said softly, as if reading his thoughts, "but it's home." "It's a fine place," Miles replied sincerely. "Your father built it himself, didn't he?" Adelaide turned slightly in the saddle, surprise evident in her expression. "Yes, he did. How did you know?" "My pa helped him raise the barn," Miles explained as they approached the house. "I was just a boy then, but I remember your father saying he'd built every inch of this house with your mother in mind." A small smile touched Adelaide's lips. "He did. There's a heart he carved into the porch railing on their first anniversary. It's still there." Miles helped her dismount when they reached the front of the house, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. He couldn't help but notice how slight she felt beneath his touch, as if the burden of running the farm alone had worn away at her very substance. "I'll take care of the water," he said, unhooking the bucket. "Where does it need to go?" Adelaide pointed toward the garden. "The vegetables need it most. I've been trying to save what I can." Miles nodded and carried the bucket to the garden, carefully distributing the precious water among the struggling plants. When he returned to the porch, he found Adelaide sitting on the steps, her head in her hands. "Miss Porter, are you feeling unwell again?" She looked up, quickly wiping at her eyes. "No, I'm fine, just a moment of weakness. It won't happen again." Miles sat down beside her, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "There's no weakness in feeling overwhelmed. What you're trying to do here, all alone, it would break most men I know." Adelaide let out a humorless laugh. "According to the bank, it's breaking me too. Mr. Hollister gave me until the end of summer to come up with the mortgage payment or he'll foreclose." Miles frowned. Richard Hollister, the bank manager, was known for his ruthlessness when it came to business matters. "How much do you owe?" $200, she replied, the sum hanging heavily in the air between them. It might as well have been 2,000 for all the chance she had of raising it. Miles was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the farm. He had seen properties like this one swallowed up by larger operations time and again over the years. Something about the thought of Adelaide losing her family home made his chest tighten uncomfortably. "I work for the Broken Spur," he said finally. "Mr. Taylor is looking to expand his herd before winter. He's going to need extra hands for the roundup next week." Adelaide shook her head. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Vance, but I don't see how I could put in a word for your brother," Miles continued. "The pay would be good and it might help with that payment to the bank." The color drained from Adelaide's face. "My brother," Miles realized his mistake immediately. "James, isn't it? I thought he was helping you with the farm." Adelaide's hands twisted in her lap. "James left for California 2 years ago after our parents died. He said there was nothing left for him here." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I haven't heard from him since." Miles silently cursed himself. He had heard rumors about the Porter boy leaving but hadn't known the circumstances. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed." Adelaide stood abruptly, smoothing down her skirt with trembling hands. "It's getting late, Mr. Vance. I appreciate your help today, but I have chores to finish before dark." Miles recognized the dismissal for what it was. He rose to his feet, placing his hat back on his head. "Of course, I didn't mean to overstay my welcome." He walked to his horse, untying the reins from the porch railing. As he prepared to mount, he turned back to Adelaide, who stood watching him with a carefully neutral expression. "Miss Porter," he began, "I meant what I said about the Broken Spur needing extra hands. The offer wasn't just for your brother. We could use someone to help with the cooking for the roundup crew. It pays well." Adelaide's eyes widened slightly. "You're offering me a job," Miles nodded. "Just for a couple of weeks, but it might help with that bank payment." For a moment, he thought she might refuse outright. Pride was a powerful thing, especially when it was one of the few possessions a person had left. But then her shoulders sagged slightly, and he glimpsed the weight of her burdens in the slump of her posture. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Miles," he reminded her with a small smile. "Miles," she echoed, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "And thank you for the water and for bringing me home." He tipped his hat to her. "A man doesn't leave a lady to fend for herself, Miss Porter, not in this country." As he rode away from the Porter farm, Miles couldn't shake the image of Adelaide standing on her porch, a solitary figure against the backdrop of failing crops and fading dreams. Something about her stubborn determination stirred emotions he hadn't felt in a long time, not since before the war, when he had still believed in things like justice and happy endings. By the time he reached the broken spur, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The main house was lit up, smoke curling from the chimney despite the summer heat. Samuel Taylor, the ranch owner, was particular about his evening comforts, regardless of the season. Miles stabled his horse and made his way to the bunkhouse, his mind still on Adelaide Porter and her struggling farm. He was so distracted that he almost collided with Frank Thompson, the ranch foreman, as he exited the building. "Watch yourself, Vance," Frank said gruffly, though there was no real anger in his tone. "You're late getting back from town. Taylor was asking after you." "Had to help someone in need," Miles replied, removing his hat as they entered the bunkhouse together. "Frank, you remember John Porter, had that farm over by Willow Creek," Frank nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Good man. Shame about him and his wife passing like they did. Heard the place is falling to pieces now." "His daughter's trying to keep it going," Miles said, accepting the cup Frank offered him. "On her own." Frank raised his eyebrows. "That's so, must be a tough woman." "She is," Miles agreed. "But she's in trouble with the bank. Needs to make a payment by the end of summer or she loses everything." Frank studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. "And you're telling me this because—" Miles shifted uncomfortably under the older man's scrutiny. "I thought maybe we could use an extra cook for the roundup. She could use the money, and you know Mrs. Finley's been complaining about needing help with all the extra mouths to feed." Frank's expression remained neutral, but there was a knowing gleam in his eyes. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that Adelaide Porter is the prettiest young woman in the county, would it?" Miles felt heat creep into his face that had nothing to do with the coffee. "It's not like that. She needs help and we need an extra cook. Seems simple enough." Frank chuckled, slapping Miles on the shoulder as he moved toward the door. "I'll talk to Taylor about it. No promises, but if she's half the cook her mother was, he'll probably agree." "Thanks, Frank," Miles said, relief evident in his voice. "Don't thank me yet," the foreman replied with a wink. "Mrs. Finley might not take kindly to having another woman in her kitchen. You know how territorial she is about those pots and pans." As Frank left, Miles sank onto his bunk, removing his boots with a weary sigh. The other hands would be back soon, and the bunkhouse would fill with the usual noise and banter. But for now, the relative quiet gave him space to think. He hadn't been entirely honest with Frank. While it was true that the broken spur could use an extra cook for the roundup, and Adelaide certainly needed the money, his motivations weren't entirely altruistic. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a stubborn resilience that had caught his attention long before he'd found her collapsed by the well. Miles had seen too many good people broken by circumstances beyond their control, especially after the war. The thought of Adelaide Porter losing her family home to Richard Hollister's bank sat poorly with him. If a temporary cooking job could help her keep what was rightfully hers, then he'd make sure she got that opportunity. With that resolution firmly in mind, Miles stretched out on his bunk, his thoughts drifting to hazel eyes and the heart carved into a porch railing as sleep claimed him. Adelaide woke before dawn the next morning, her body aching from the previous day's exertion. The memory of her collapse at the well and Miles Vance's subsequent rescue brought a flush of embarrassment to her cheeks. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to manage without having to rely on others. Having a man, a virtual stranger, no less witness her moment of weakness was mortifying. Still, she couldn't deny the kindness he had shown her, nor could she dismiss his offer of work at the Broken Spur out of hand. The reality was that she needed money, and quickly. The small amount she had managed to save from selling eggs and vegetables at the weekly market wouldn't come close to covering what she owed the bank. Adelaide moved through her morning chores, methodically feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and tending to her small vegetable garden with the remaining water in her rain barrel. The heat was already building, promising another scorching day ahead. As she worked, she considered Miles Vance's offer. She had heard of the Broken Spur. Of course, it was one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. Samuel Taylor had a reputation as a fair employer, though he was known to be demanding and particular about how things were done on his ranch. Working as a cook for the roundup crew would mean leaving the farm unattended for at least 2 weeks. The crops were already struggling. Could they survive her absence? But if she didn't find a way to make that bank payment, the crops wouldn't matter anyway. By mid-morning, Adelaide had made her decision. She would go into town, send word to the Broken Spur accepting the position if it was still available, and speak with her neighbor, old Mrs. Whittaker, about keeping an eye on the farm while she was gone. She had just changed into her one good dress, a faded blue cotton that had once belonged to her mother, when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Moving to the window, she was surprised to see Miles Vance riding up to her house, this time accompanied by an older woman in a wagon. Adelaide quickly pinned her hair back and hurried out onto the porch, curiosity overriding her earlier embarrassment. "Mr. Vance," she called as he dismounted, "this is unexpected." Miles removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Miss Porter." "I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, her gaze shifting to the stern-faced woman who remained seated in the wagon. "Good morning, madam. This is Mrs. Finley," Miles introduced. "She's the head cook at the Broken Spur." The older woman nodded curtly. "So you're John Porter's girl," she said, her sharp eyes taking in Adelaide's appearance with undisguised assessment. "Your mother and I used to exchange recipes at church socials. She made a fine apple pie." Adelaide felt a pang at the mention of her mother. "Thank you. She taught me everything she knew about cooking." Mrs. Finley grunted, though whether in approval or skepticism, Adelaide couldn't tell. "Miles here says you might be interested in helping with the roundup cooking. I told Mr. Taylor I'd come see for myself if you'd be up to the task." Adelaide straightened her shoulders. "I'm a hard worker, Mrs. Finley. I can cook for 20 men if need be." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "It'll be closer to 30, girl, and they eat like they've been starving for a month every meal." She gestured toward the house. "Why don't you show me your kitchen? Let's see what you can do." Adelaide led them inside, acutely aware of the simplicity of her home compared to what must be the grandeur of the Broken Spur. The kitchen was small but neat, with her mother's collection of herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and well-used cookware arranged carefully on shelves. "I was just about to prepare lunch," Adelaide said, moving to the stove. "It's nothing fancy, just cornbread and bean soup, but you're welcome to stay." Mrs. Finley nodded, seating herself at the kitchen table. "That'll do fine. A cook who can make something out of nothing is exactly what we need on a roundup." Miles remained standing, his tall frame making the kitchen seem even smaller. "I'll wait outside," he offered, clearly sensing that Mrs. Finley wanted to evaluate Adelaide without his presence. As he stepped out, Adelaide felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. She turned her attention to preparing the meal, aware of Mrs. Finley's scrutiny as she moved about the kitchen. "So," the older woman said after a few minutes of silence, "Miles seems to have taken quite an interest in your situation." Adelaide nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. "Mr. Vance has been kind," she said carefully. "He helped me when I was in need." Mrs. Finley made a non-committal sound. "He's a good man, that one. Been with the Broken Spur for 5 years now. Mr. Taylor trusts him more than most." Adelaide nodded, unsure how to respond to this information. She focused on mixing the cornbread batter, her movements practiced and efficient despite her awareness of being watched. "He fought in the war, you know," Mrs. Finley continued, her voice softening slightly. "Came back different like many did. Doesn't talk about it much, but you can see it in his eyes sometimes." Adelaide hadn't known this about Miles, but it explained the occasional shadow she had glimpsed in his gaze. Many men had returned from the conflict between North and South, changed in ways both visible and invisible. "My brother served as well," she said quietly. "He was never the same afterward." Mrs. Finley nodded sagely. "War changes a man. Some find their way back to who they were, some don't." She watched as Adelaide slid the cornbread into the oven. "Your brother, is he helping you with the farm?" Adelaide shook her head, stirring the bean soup to avoid meeting the older woman's eyes. "He left for California after our parents died. I haven't heard from him since." "So you're managing this place all on your own?" Mrs. Finley asked, though it wasn't really a question. When Adelaide nodded, the cook clicked her tongue. "That's no small feat, girl. You should be proud." "Pride doesn't pay the bank," Adelaide replied, more sharply than she'd intended. "I'm sorry, that was rude." Mrs. Finley waved away the apology. "No need to apologize for speaking truth. Pride's a fine thing, but it won't keep a roof over your head." She studied Adelaide thoughtfully. "The roundup job pays $15 a week, plus room and board. It's hard work, long days, hot conditions, and cowboys who'll complain if the coffee's too weak or the biscuits are too hard." "Think you can handle that?" Adelaide felt a surge of hope. $30 would be a significant contribution toward what she owed the bank. "Yes, madam, I can handle it." Mrs. Finley nodded, seemingly satisfied. "We start day after tomorrow. Miles can bring the wagon to fetch you at dawn." She rose from the table as Adelaide began to ladle the soup into bowls. "I think I've seen enough. You know your way around a kitchen, that's clear." "What about lunch?" Adelaide asked, gesturing to the food she'd prepared. "Keep it for yourself, girl. You look like you could use a good meal, Mrs. Finley moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, there are rules at the Broken Spur. The men sleep in the bunkhouse, the women in the main house. No exceptions, no matter how pretty a cowboy might look in his Sunday best. Mr. Taylor runs a respectable operation." Adelaide felt her cheeks flame. "I assure you, Mrs. Finley, I'm not looking for anything of that nature. I need the work, that's all." The older woman's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Just so we're clear. Now I'll tell Miles the good news. Finish your lunch, then pack whatever you'll need for a 2-week stay. And bring that cornbread recipe of yours. If it's half as good as it smells, the men will be pleased." After Mrs. Finley left, Adelaide sank into a chair, a mixture of emotions washing over her. Relief at securing work that would help with her financial troubles, anxiety about leaving the farm, and beneath it all, a flutter of something she couldn't quite name whenever she thought of Miles Vance and the kindness in his eyes when he had helped her home. She pushed the latter feeling aside firmly. Mrs. Finley's warning had been clear, and Adelaide had no intention of complicating her life further with romantic entanglements. This was about survival, about keeping her family's legacy intact, nothing more. Still, as she ate her simple meal and planned what to pack for her stay at the Broken Spur, Adelaide couldn't help but wonder what the coming weeks would bring. For the first time in months, the future held something other than endless toil and inevitable failure. It wasn't much, just a temporary position and a modest wage, but it was hope. And hope, she was beginning to realize, was something she had been without for far too long. 2 days later, Adelaide stood on her porch at dawn, a small trunk at her feet containing her clothing and personal items. She had spent the previous day preparing the farm for her absence, harvesting what vegetables were ready, securing the chicken coop, and speaking with Mrs. Whittaker, who had agreed to collect eggs and keep an eye on things while Adelaide was gone. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Miles appeared around the bend in the road, driving a wagon rather than riding horseback. "Morning, Miss Porter," he called as he drew closer. "Ready for your adventure?" Adelaide managed a small smile, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. Miles jumped down from the wagon and approached the porch. Mrs. Finley was impressed with you, he said, picking up her trunk with ease. Said you reminded her of herself when she was younger. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not, Adelaide replied, thinking of the cook's formidable demeanor. Miles laughed, a rich sound that sent an unexpected warmth through Adelaide's chest. Oh, it's definitely a compliment, Mrs. Finley doesn't impress easily. He secured her trunk in the back of the wagon. The ranch hands are gathering today. Roundup starts tomorrow at first light. Adelaide nodded, taking a last look at her home before allowing Miles to help her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was warm and calloused against hers, the touch brief but oddly reassuring. As they set off down the dusty road, Adelaide tried to focus on the practicalities of what lay ahead rather than the man beside her. What exactly will my duties be? She asked. Mrs. Finley didn't go into much detail. Miles kept his eyes on the road as he answered. You'll be helping Mrs. Finley prepare 3 meals a day for the Roundup crew. Breakfast before dawn, dinner at midday, we bring it out to wherever the men are working, and supper back at camp after the day's done. That sounds extensive, Adelaide said, mentally calculating the amount of food needed to feed 30 hungry men 3 times a day. It is, Miles agreed, but Mrs. Finley has it down to a science. She's been doing this for 20 years. He glanced at her, a reassuring smile playing on his lips. Don't worry, you won't be thrown to the wolves. She'll show you the ropes. They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled on, the landscape gradually changing from farmland to the more rugged terrain that characterized the Broken Spur's vast acreage. After about an hour, Miles pointed to a distant cluster of buildings. There it is, he said. Home sweet home, at least for the next couple of weeks. Adelaide's eyes widened as they drew closer. The Broken Spur was larger than she had imagined, a sprawling main house, a bunkhouse nearly as big, several barns and outbuildings, and corrals filled with horses being prepared for the roundup. It's impressive, she managed, suddenly feeling very small and out of place. Miles seemed to sense her unease. Don't let the size fool you, he said gently. It's just a working ranch like any other, just bigger. As they pulled up to the main house, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver at his temples emerged onto the porch. Samuel Taylor, Adelaide presumed, the owner of all this. Ah, Vance, he called. I see you've brought our new cook safely. Miles helped Adelaide down from the wagon. Mr. Taylor, this is Miss Adelaide Porter. Miss Porter, Samuel Taylor, owner of the Broken Spur. Adelaide extended her hand, determined to make a good impression despite her nerves. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Taylor. Thank you for the opportunity to work for you. Taylor shook her hand firmly, his shrewd eyes assessing her much as Mrs. Finley had done. John Porter's daughter, he said, nodding as if confirming something to himself. Your father was a good man, did business with him a time or two. Thank you, sir, Adelaide replied, touched that her father was remembered with respect. Mrs. Finley's waiting for you in the kitchen, Taylor said, gesturing toward the house. She's eager to get started with the preparations. Miles, see to Miss Porter's trunk, then report to Frank. He's assigning horses for tomorrow. With that, Taylor strode off toward one of the barns, leaving Adelaide standing somewhat uncertainly beside the wagon. Don't mind his brusqueness, Miles said, lifting her trunk from the back. He's always like that before a roundup all business. Adelaide nodded, smoothing down her dress nervously. I should find Mrs. Finley. I'll show you to the kitchen first, Miles offered, carrying her trunk with ease as they walked toward the main house. Your room will be upstairs next to Mrs. Finley's. The men aren't allowed in the main house except for meals, so you'll have your privacy. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, polished wooden floors, quality furnishings, and a sense of solid prosperity that made Adelaide acutely aware of her own modest circumstances. Miles led her through to a large, well-equipped kitchen where Mrs. Finley was already at work, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded a massive amount of dough. There you are, the cook said by way of greeting. Put her trunk in the blue room, Miles, then get out of my kitchen. We've got work to do. Miles gave Adelaide a quick wink before disappearing with her trunk, leaving her alone with Mrs. Finley. "Don't just stand there, girl," the older woman said, though her tone lacked real sharpness. "Wash your hands and put on an apron. We've got 30 hungry men to feed tonight, and that's just the beginning." Adelaide did as she was told, rolling up her sleeves and tying one of the clean aprons hanging by the door around her waist. "What would you like me to do first, Mrs.?" Finley gestured to a mountain of potatoes on the counter. "Start peeling. We're making a beef stew that'll feed an army, cornbread, and apple pies for dessert. Tomorrow morning, it's eggs, bacon, biscuits, and enough coffee to float a ship." Adelaide picked up a knife and got to work, the familiar task helping to settle her nerves. As they worked side by side, Mrs. Finley began to explain the routines and expectations for the roundup cooking. "We rise at 4, she said, punching down the dough with practiced movements. "Breakfast is served at 5. The men head out by 6. At 10, you and I load the chuck wagon with dinner and follow them out to wherever they're working. Dinner at noon, then back to prepare supper for when they return at dusk." "That's a lot of cooking," Adelaide observed, her hands moving steadily through the pile of potatoes. Mrs. Finley snorted. "That's just the beginning, girl. Wait until you see how much these men can eat after a day of chasing cattle across the range." By the time evening came, Adelaide's back ached and her hands were red from work, but there was satisfaction in seeing the long tables in the dining room laden with food. Mrs. Finley had been right. The men ate like they were starving, though not without appreciation for the meal. Adelaide caught glimpses of Miles throughout the evening, seated among the other ranch hands, laughing at something one of them said. Once, their eyes met across the room, and he offered her a small nod of encouragement that inexplicably lifted her spirits. Later, as she settled into her assigned bedroom, a neat, comfortable space with a real feather mattress, a luxury she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths, Adelaide found herself reflecting on the day's events. The work was hard, yes, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. For the first time in months, she had gone an entire day without worrying about the bank, the mortgage, or the failing crops back home. As exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, Adelaide wondered if perhaps this temporary position might offer more than just financial relief. Perhaps it might also give her something she had almost forgotten existed: a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond mere survival. With that comforting thought, she drifted off to sleep. The distant sound of men's voices from the bunkhouse, a reminder that she was no longer alone in her struggles. The next 5 days passed in a blur of activity for Adelaide. The roundup was in full swing, with the cowboys spending long days out on the range, gathering cattle from the far corners of the Broken Spur's extensive holdings. True to Mrs. Finley's word, Adelaide rose each morning before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the hungry crew, then spent the morning cooking for the midday meal that would be transported to wherever the men were working. It was during these midday meals that Adelaide began to see a different side of ranch life. The men, dusty and tired from their morning's work, would gather around the chuck wagon with a camaraderie that reminded her of how her father and his friends used to be during harvest time. There was good-natured teasing, boisterous laughter, and always appreciation for the food she and Mrs. Finley provided. Miles often sought her out during these breaks, sometimes bringing her a cup of coffee or simply checking that she was managing in the heat. These brief interactions, though entirely proper and often within full view of the others, had become something Adelaide found herself looking forward to with unexpected eagerness. On the 6th day, as she was clearing away the remains of the midday meal, Miles approached the chuck wagon. He looked tired, with dust coating his clothing and a day's growth of stubble darkening his jaw, but his eyes brightened when he saw her. "Miss Porter," he said, removing his hat. "Mrs. Finley mentioned you might need help collecting firewood for tonight's cooking." Adelaide glanced toward where Mrs. Finley was packing up the last of the cooking utensils. The older woman seemed deliberately absorbed in her task, though Adelaide suspected she was listening to every word. "That's kind of you, Mr. Vance," Adelaide replied, keeping her tone neutral despite the quickening of her pulse. "But surely you have duties with the herd. Frank gave me an hour to help with camp matters, Miles explained, replacing his hat against the sun's glare. The men need to rest the horses anyway before the afternoon push. Mrs. Finley finally looked up, her expression unreadable. Go on then, girl, she said to Adelaide. I can finish up here, just be back in time to help with the supper preparations. Adelaide nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before removing it. Thank you, Mrs. Finley. As she walked with Miles toward a nearby grove of trees, Adelaide was acutely aware of the eyes following them. The ranch hands might be focused on their own rest, but little escaped notice in a roundup camp. Mrs. Finley didn't really need firewood, did she? Adelaide asked quietly once they were out of earshot. Miles's lips quirked in a half-smile. She might have mentioned needing some, and I might have volunteered rather quickly. Adelaide felt a blush creep into her cheeks, but she couldn't suppress a small smile of her own. That was thoughtful of you. Truthfully, Miles said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, I wanted to ask how you're finding everything. The work isn't too much, Adelaide considered the question as they entered the shade of the trees. The past days had been exhausting, certainly, but also rewarding in ways she hadn't anticipated. It's hard work, she admitted, but good work. Mrs. Finley is a patient teacher despite her gruff manner. Miles nodded, bending to gather fallen branches. She likes you, you know. Says you're a natural in the kitchen, just like your mother was. The mention of her mother brought a pang of both sadness and pride. Thank you for telling me that. It means a great deal. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, gathering enough wood to last the evening's cooking. When Miles spoke again, his tone was hesitant, unlike his usual confidence. I rode by your farm yesterday, he said, not meeting her eyes as he bundled branches together. Hope you don't mind. I wanted to make sure everything was all right in your absence. Adelaide paused in her own gathering. You did? How did it look? Good, Miles assured her. Mrs. Whittaker was there, collecting eggs just like you arranged. Said she'd been watering your garden too, since there was a little rain 2 nights ago. Relief washed over Adelaide. She had been worrying about the farm more than she cared to admit, especially given how close she was cutting it with the bank payment deadline. Thank you, she said softly. That eases my mind considerably. Miles finally looked at her directly, and the warmth in his gaze sent a flutter through her chest. I know what it's like, he said, to worry about a place that's more than just land and buildings, to have it be part of who you are. There was something in his voice, a hint of old pain, perhaps, that made Adelaide wonder about his past. In the week she had known him, Miles had revealed little about himself beyond his present role at the Broken Spur. You sound like you speak from experience, she ventured carefully. Miles's expression clouded briefly. My family had a small ranch in Texas before the war, he said after a moment. Nothing as grand as the Broken Spur, but it was ours. My father built it from nothing. What happened? Adelaide asked, though she suspected from his tone that the story didn't have a happy ending. Miles secured the bundle of wood he'd gathered with a length of twine. Confederate soldiers took our horses in '63. Union troops burned what was left the following year. My father died defending it. His voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion, though Adelaide could sense the pain beneath the words. I'm so sorry, she said, the phrase inadequate for the loss he had described. Miles shrugged, the gesture at odds with the gravity of his words. It was a long time ago. I was already fighting by then, didn't hear about it until months later. He straightened, meeting her gaze again. But it's why I understand what you're trying to do, Adelaide, why your farm matters. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. Sometimes I think I'm fighting a losing battle, she admitted, voicing the fear that had been her constant companion for months. One woman against nature, the bank, and seemingly everything else. Miles took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his brown eyes. You're not alone in the fight anymore, he said quietly. Not if you don't want to be. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Adelaide felt herself drawn toward him, her usual caution momentarily forgotten, but before either of them could move, a distant call broke the spell. "Miles, Miss Porter," Frank's voice carried from the direction of the camp. "Mrs. Finley's looking for you both." Miles stepped back, the connection broken but not forgotten. "We should head back," he said, though he looked reluctant to do so. Adelaide nodded, gathering her own bundle of wood. As they walked back toward camp, she found herself wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. Mrs. Finley gave them both a knowing look when they returned with the firewood, but said nothing beyond instructing Adelaide to begin preparations for the evening meal. As she worked beside the older woman, Adelaide's thoughts kept returning to that moment in the grove, to the way Miles had looked at her, to the promise implicit in his words, "You're not alone in the fight anymore." For someone who had been shouldering her burdens alone for so long, the offer of supportive partnership was almost too tempting to resist. But Adelaide had learned the hard way that relying on others came with risks. Her brother had abandoned her when she needed him most. Could she trust that Miles wouldn't do the same once the roundup was over and she returned to her struggling farm? That night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the men sharing stories around the campfire, Adelaide made a decision. For the remaining week of the roundup, she would focus on the work she had been hired to do. The wages she earned would help save her farm that had to be her priority. Whatever was developing between her and Miles Vance would have to wait until she was on more solid ground. Still, as sleep claimed her, Adelaide couldn't help but remember the warmth in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to hope for something beyond mere survival. The second week of the roundup brought a change in the weather. The relentless heat that had plagued Malad City for weeks finally broke, replaced by cooler temperatures and the promise of rain on the horizon. The cooler weather was a blessing for the work, allowing the men to push longer and harder in their efforts to gather the remaining cattle. For Adelaide, the days continued in much the same pattern: early mornings in the kitchen with Mrs. Finley, midday meals delivered to the men in the field, and evenings spent preparing hearty suppers for the tired crew. But despite her resolution to focus solely on her work, she found herself increasingly aware of Miles's presence whenever he was nearby. He seemed to be making a similar effort to maintain a proper distance, their interactions limited to polite exchanges during meals and occasional updates about the progress of the roundup. Yet Adelaide caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression thoughtful and intent in a way that made her heart beat faster. On the 11th day, as the roundup was nearing its conclusion, the promised rain finally arrived, not in the gentle shower everyone had hoped for, but in a sudden, violent thunderstorm that sent the men racing back to camp in the early afternoon. Adelaide and Mrs. Finley were in the main house kitchen when the first riders galloped into the yard, rain-soaked and shouting warnings to those still out with the herd. Through the window, Adelaide watched anxiously as more men arrived, searching each face for Miles. "He'll be fine, girl, Mrs. Finley said, noting her concern. "Miles Vance has weathered worse than a summer storm." Adelaide nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She busied herself preparing coffee and heating stew for the returning men, trying to ignore the knot of worry in her stomach. It was nearly an hour before the last group of riders appeared, leading several strays they had managed to round up despite the storm. Miles was among them, his clothing plastered to his body, his hat pulled low against the driving rain. The relief Adelaide felt at seeing him safe was so intense it nearly made her knees buckle. She turned quickly back to the stove, afraid her expression might reveal too much. Mrs. Finley gave her a knowing look but said only, "Take some towels out to the men, Adelaide. They'll be needing to dry off before they come in for food." Grateful for the task, Adelaide gathered an armful of towels and hurried out to the porch, where the men were dismounting and leading their horses toward the barn. She distributed the towels quickly, her gaze inevitably finding Miles as he handed his horse off to one of the younger hands. "You're soaked through," she said as she offered him a towel, trying to keep her tone light despite her lingering concern. Miles took the towel with a grateful nod, wiping rain from his face. "It came on fast," he said, his voice slightly hoarse from shouting over the storm. "We were lucky to get the cattle into the draw before the lightning started." A crash of thunder punctuated his words, making Adelaide jump slightly. Miles instinctively stepped closer, as if to shield her, then seemed to remember himself and moved back. "You should get inside," he said, rubbing the towel over his dripping hair. "No sense in both of us getting drenched." Adelaide hesitated, reluctant to leave despite the rain now spattering the porch. "There's hot coffee in the kitchen," she offered, "and stew. Mrs. Finley thought you might all need warming up." Miles's smile was tired but genuine. "That sounds like heaven right about now." He glanced toward the barn where the other men were settling the horses. "I'll be in as soon as I've made sure the animals are taken care of." Adelaide nodded and turned to go back inside, but Miles caught her arm gently. "Adelaide," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the rain. "I was thinking, after the roundup is finished tomorrow, maybe we could talk about what comes next." Her heart skipped a beat at the implication in his words. "Next," Miles's eyes held her steadily. "For you." "For the farm." A pause then, more softly, "For us, maybe." Before she could respond, Frank called from the barn, needing Miles's help with something. With a last meaningful look, Miles released her arm and hurried through the rain toward the barn. Adelaide returned to the kitchen in a daze, her mind whirling with the possibilities his words had opened up. What did he mean by us? And what could he possibly be proposing regarding her farm? Mrs. Finley took one look at her flushed face and shook her head. "Whatever he said to put that look in your eyes, girl, remember that actions speak louder than words. Many a man has made promises in the heat of the moment." "It wasn't like that," Adelaide protested, though she appreciated the older woman's protective instinct. He wants to talk." "After the roundup," Mrs. Finley's expression softened slightly. "Miles Vance is one of the good ones, I'll grant you that. Just be careful with your heart, Adelaide. It's a precious thing to risk." The rest of the afternoon and evening passed in a blur of activity as the men, confined to the bunkhouse and barns by the continuing storm, grew restless and hungry. Adelaide and Mrs. Finley served an early supper, then prepared extra bread and coffee to tide the men over through what promised to be a long, storm-bound evening. It was past midnight when Adelaide finally retired to her room, the sound of rain still pounding on the roof. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she replayed Miles's words in her mind. What comes next? For the past 3 years, since her parents' deaths, Adelaide had been focused solely on survival, on making it through each day, each season, with her home intact and food on her table. The idea of something next, something beyond mere existence, was both thrilling and terrifying. Could she trust the feeling growing between her and Miles? Was she reading too much into his words, his looks, the way he seemed to seek her out even when there was no practical reason to do so? And even if his intentions were as serious as they seemed, could she reconcile her independent nature with the possibility of sharing her life and her burdens with someone else? These questions chased each other through her mind as the storm gradually abated and sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of the morning. The final day of the roundup dawned clear and fresh, the world washed clean by the night's rain. The cowboys set out at first light to gather the last of the strays that had scattered during the storm, while Adelaide and Mrs. Finley prepared for one last day of field cooking. "Mr. Taylor is pleased with how the roundup went," Mrs. Finley told Adelaide as they loaded the chuck wagon. "Says it's one of the most successful he can remember, despite that storm yesterday." Adelaide smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment at having contributed to that success, however modestly. "I'm glad to hear it." "He also mentioned that he was impressed with your work," the older woman continued, giving Adelaide a significant look. "Said he might be interested in offering you more regular employment if you were interested." Adelaide's hands stilled on the pot she was securing. Regular employment. "Here at the Broken Spur," Mrs. Finley nodded. I'm not getting any younger, girl. Could use the help year-round, not just during roundups. She paused, then added with uncharacteristic gentleness, it would be steady income, might help with that bank situation of yours. Adelaide's mind raced with the implications. Regular employment at the Broken Spur would indeed provide the financial stability she desperately needed. But it would also mean leaving her farm for extended periods, perhaps eventually giving it up entirely. The thought sent a pang through her heart. That land had been in her family for 2 generations. Her father had built the house with his own hands, had worked the soil until it yielded crops when others said it couldn't be done. Could she really consider abandoning it, even for the security of a position at the Broken Spur? You don't have to decide now, Mrs. Finley said, correctly interpreting her silence. Mr. Taylor said to tell you the offer stands whenever you're ready to consider it. Adelaide nodded gratefully. Thank you for telling me, I'll think about it. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity as the last of the cattle were brought in, counted, and sorted. By late afternoon, the roundup was officially complete, with the Broken Spur's herd increased by nearly 300 head, a significant success by any measure. Mr. Taylor announced that there would be a celebration that evening, a special supper followed by music, and perhaps even dancing if some of the men fetched their instruments from the bunkhouse. It was a tradition after a successful roundup, he explained to Adelaide, a way to thank the crew for their hard work before they returned to their regular duties. As Adelaide helped Mrs. Finley prepare the feast, her thoughts kept returning to Miles and his request to speak with her. Would tonight be the night? And what would she say when he finally revealed what was on his mind? The supper was a boisterous affair, with the men in high spirits after the successful completion of their work. Mr. Taylor even produced several bottles of good whiskey to mark the occasion, though he kept a careful eye on consumption to ensure the celebration didn't get out of hand. Adelaide, having changed into her one good dress for the evening, found herself the object of appreciative glances from several of the cowboys. She accepted their compliments with polite smiles, but her eyes kept seeking out Miles among the crowd. He found her just as the impromptu band 3 cowboys with a fiddle, harmonica, and guitar began to play. The tables had been pushed back against the walls of the dining room to create a space for dancing, and several of the men were already leading Mrs. Finley and the 2 housemaids in a lively reel. Miss Porter, Miles said, appearing at her side. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his dark hair still damp from washing, his shirt fresh and his boots polished. Would you honor me with a dance? Adelaide felt a flutter of nerves but nodded, placing her hand in his outstretched one. I should warn you, Mr. Vance, I'm not much of a dancer. His smile was warm as he led her into the open space. Then we'll muddle through together. The music shifted to a slower tune as they took their places, as if the musicians had sensed the moment needed a gentler backdrop. Miles placed one hand respectfully at her waist, holding her other hand in his as they began to move to the rhythm. You mentioned wanting to talk, Adelaide said after a moment, her voice low enough that only he could hear. About what comes next, Miles nodded, his expression turning serious. I did, though perhaps this isn't the best setting for such a conversation. Adelaide glanced around at the crowded room, aware of curious eyes observing them. Perhaps not. Could you meet me on the porch after the celebration winds down? Miles suggested. It should be quiet enough then. Adelaide hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'll be there. The rest of their dance passed in companionable silence, the unspoken anticipation of their later meeting hanging between them. When the music ended, Miles escorted her back to the edge of the room with a formal correctness that belied the intensity in his gaze. Until later then, he said quietly before rejoining his fellow cowboys. The celebration continued for several hours, with dancing, singing, and storytelling filling the evening. Adelaide participated when called upon, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what she might say when she finally spoke with Miles alone. It was past 11 when the gathering began to disperse, the men returning to the bunkhouse in high spirits while Mrs. Finley directed the cleanup of the dining room, When Adelaide moved to help, the older woman waved her away. "You've worked hard enough, girl," she said with unusual gentleness. "Go get some fresh air, I can manage here." There was a knowing look in Mrs. Finley's eyes that suggested she was well aware of Adelaide's planned meeting, but she offered no further comment or warning. The night was clear and cool as Adelaide stepped onto the porch, the stars brilliant in the vast Idaho sky. Miles was already there, leaning against the railing, his profile illuminated by the soft light spilling from the house windows. He straightened as she approached, removing his hat. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "I said I would," Adelaide replied simply, moving to stand beside him at the railing. For a moment they stood in silence, looking out at the dark shapes of the outbuildings and corrals. When Miles finally spoke, his voice was low and earnest. "I've been thinking about your situation, Adelaide. About the farm and the bank payment you're facing." Adelaide felt a flicker of disappointment. Had she misread his intentions? Was his interest purely practical after all? "Mrs. Finley mentioned that Mr. Taylor might offer me a position here," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "It would help with the financial situation, certainly." Miles nodded. "It would, and you'd be good at it. You've proven that these past 2 weeks." He turned to face her directly. "But is that what you want, to leave your farm behind?" The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. I don't know," she admitted. "The farm is all I have left of my family. The thought of losing it feels like losing them all over again." Miles's expression softened with understanding. "That's what I thought." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say next. "I have a proposition for you, Adelaide, one that might allow you to keep your farm and still make that bank payment." Adelaide's pulse quickened. "What kind of proposition?" "A partnership," Miles said simply. "I have some savings, not a fortune, but enough to cover your immediate debt to the bank. In return, I'd ask for a stake in the farm. We'd work it together." Adelaide stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "You want to buy into my farm? Why would you do that? It's barely producing enough to sustain one person, let alone make a profit." "Because I believe it can be more," Miles said with conviction. "With 2 of us working it, with some of the techniques I've learned here at the Broken Spur, I think we could make it thrive again." He paused, then added more softly, "And because I've come to care for you, Adelaide. More than I expected to, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Adelaide felt a surge of emotion, hope, fear, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. "This is unexpected," she managed, her voice not entirely steady. Miles smiled slightly. "I know it's sudden, and I'm not asking for any promises beyond the business arrangement, not yet." His eyes held her steadily. "Just the chance to work beside you to help you save what matters to you. The rest can come in its own time if it's meant to." It was, Adelaide realized, the perfect answer, respectful of her independence while still acknowledging the connection that had grown between them. He was offering help without demanding control, partnership without presumption. "What about your position here?" she asked. "Mr. Taylor seems to value you highly." "I've spoken with him already," Miles admitted. "He understands, said he'd keep a place for me if things don't work out, but—" He smiled again, more confidently this time. "I think they will." Adelaide took a deep breath, looking out at the star-filled sky as she considered his offer. It was a risk, certainly inviting this man she had known for barely 2 weeks into her life, her business, potentially her heart. But something about it felt right in a way few things had since her parents' deaths. "I would want everything in writing," she said finally, turning back to him. "A proper business agreement with the terms clearly stated." Miles nodded solemnly. "Of course. We can have Mr. Henderson draw up the papers when we return to town. And you should know what you're getting into," Adelaide continued, needing to be completely honest. "The south field hasn't produced properly in 2 seasons. The roof of the barn leaks. The well is running dry. It's not going to be easy." "I don't expect easy," Miles replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I expect worthwhile. There's a difference." The simple wisdom of his words struck a chord in Adelaide's heart. For so long, she had been focusing on the difficulty of her path, the seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Miles was offering a perspective that acknowledged the challenges while still seeing the value beyond them. "All right," she said, the decision feeling both momentous and somehow inevitable. "Partners?" Miles's smile was like sunrise breaking over the horizon, gradual, then brilliant. He extended his hand and she took it, the handshake sealing their agreement with a simple dignity that felt appropriate to the moment. "Partners," he echoed, his hand warm and solid around hers. They stood there on the porch for a long time afterward, talking of practical matters when they would return to town. What improvements the farm needed most urgently, how they would divide the labor between them. But beneath the practical discussion ran a current of something deeper, a shared understanding that this partnership might grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for. When Adelaide finally bid him good night and went inside, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She knew the return to her farm, the formalization of their agreement, the work of rebuilding what had begun to crumble under her solitary care. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, she would not be facing those challenges alone. And that knowledge, more than anything, allowed her to fall asleep with a sense of peace that had long eluded her. 2 days later, Adelaide stood on the porch of her farmhouse, watching as Miles drove his wagon up the dusty road toward the barn. The return to Malad City had been a flurry of activity, collecting her wages from Mr. Taylor, saying goodbye to Mrs. Finley, who had pressed a book of recipes into her hands with gruff affection, and meeting with Mr. Henderson, the town lawyer, to draw up the partnership agreement between herself and Miles. Now, as she observed Miles unloading supplies from the wagon seed for fall planting, tools, provisions for the coming weeks, the reality of their arrangement began to truly sink in. This man, who less than 3 weeks ago had been little more than a nodding acquaintance in town, was now her business partner. Her future was tied to his in ways she was still coming to terms with. "Where would you like these?" Miles called, holding up a sack of flour and another of sugar luxuries Adelaide hadn't been able to afford in months. "In the kitchen pantry," she replied, moving down the steps to help him. "I'll show you." As they carried the supplies inside, Adelaide was acutely aware of how different the house felt with Miles's presence filling it. For so long, it had been a quiet place, haunted by memories and echoing with absence. Now it seemed to come alive again, as if it too had been waiting for something to change. "It's a good house," Miles commented as they arranged the supplies in the pantry. "Solid construction. Your father knew what he was doing." Adelaide nodded, touched by his appreciation for her father's workmanship. "He built it to last generations," she said quietly. "He always said he was building not just for us, but for our children and grandchildren." A moment of silence followed her words, both of them perhaps thinking of the implications, the possibility of future generations in this house that now belonged, in part, to both of them. "We should assess what needs doing most urgently," Miles said, efficiently changing the subject. "I noticed the fence on the north side is down in places, and you mentioned the barn roof." Adelaide was grateful for the shift to practical matters. "Yes, and the well needs to be deepened if possible. It's been running lower each year." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property together, making notes of repairs needed and priorities for the coming weeks. Miles was knowledgeable and practical, but also respectful of Adelaide's opinions about her family's land. He suggested rather than directed, asked rather than assumed. By the time evening approached, they had developed a comprehensive plan for the work ahead. The bank payment had been made that morning. Miles's savings, combined with Adelaide's wages from the roundup, covering the full amount, with even a small surplus, securing the farm for at least another 6 months. "I should head to the bunkhouse," Miles said as the sun began to set. They had agreed that he would stay in the small structure behind the barn that had once housed seasonal workers when the farm was more prosperous. It was a practical arrangement that also maintained propriety. An unmarried man and woman could not share a house without causing talk in a small community like Malad City. Adelaide nodded, though she found herself oddly reluctant for the day to end. Their shared purpose had created a companionship she hadn't realized how much she had missed. "I'll have breakfast ready at sunrise," she said. "We have a lot to accomplish tomorrow." Miles smiled, his eyes warm in the fading light. "That we do, partner." He tipped his hat to her and headed toward the bunkhouse, his figure silhouetted against the orange and purple sky. Adelaide watched him go, a mixture of emotions stirring within her: hope, uncertainty, and something else that made her heart beat a little faster whenever he smiled at her. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone, and for tonight, at least, that knowledge was enough. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and gradual progress. Miles proved to be as good as his word, tireless in his labor, innovative in his approaches to the farm's problems, and always respectful of the fact that it was still, fundamentally, Adelaide's home. Together they repaired fences, patched the barn roof, and with the help of 2 men from town whom Miles hired for a day's work, deepened the well to reach a more reliable water source. The late summer yielded to early fall, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that revived the parched fields. Adelaide found herself growing accustomed to Miles's presence in her daily life, his early morning coffee on the porch before the day's work began, the sound of his deep voice calling to the horses he had purchased to help with the heavier tasks, the satisfaction in his eyes when they completed another repair on her family's home. They took their evening meals together in the farmhouse kitchen, a practice that had begun as simple practicality, Adelaide cooking for both of them to save time and resources, but had evolved into something she looked forward to each day. It was during these quiet moments, with the work of the day behind them, that they truly began to know one another. Miles spoke of his childhood in Texas, of his father's dreams for their small ranch, of the war that had taken both his father's life and his own innocence. Adelaide shared stories of her parents, of her brother before he changed, of the happy years when the farm had flourished under her father's care. They avoided certain topics by unspoken agreement: the exact nature of their relationship beyond their business partnership, the future beyond the immediate tasks at hand. But even in what remained unsaid, there was a growing understanding between them, a foundation being carefully laid. One evening in early October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after a particularly productive day, Miles broke the comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, "about the south field that hasn't been producing well." Adelaide nodded, drawing her shawl closer against the evening chill. "What about it?" "I believe the soil's depleted, not ruined," Miles continued. "If we plant winter wheat there now, let it grow until spring, then plow it under without harvesting, it could restore what the soil needs." Adelaide considered the suggestion, "But we'd lose a growing season for that field." "Yes," Miles acknowledged, "but think of it as an investment, short-term loss for long-term gain. By next fall, that field could be producing better than it has in years." There was something in the way he spoke, the casual use of "we" and "next fall," that suggested a permanence to their arrangement neither had explicitly discussed. Adelaide found she didn't mind. In fact, the thought of Miles still being here a year from now brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with her shawl. "It's worth trying," she agreed. "Father used to do something similar when I was a child. He called it letting the land rest." Miles smiled. "Your father was a wise man. Some of the newer ranches push the land too hard, take too much without giving back. That's not sustainable in the long run." "Is that how you see this partnership?" Adelaide asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its implications. "As something sustainable in the long run." Miles turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but gentle. "I do," he said simply, "if that's what you want as well." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Adelaide found herself thinking of Mrs. Finley's warning about promises made in the heat of the moment. But this wasn't heat, this was a slow, steady warmth that had been building for weeks, founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I think it is," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "What I want, I mean." Miles's hand found hers on the porch railing, his calloused fingers entwining with hers in a gesture that felt both protective and requesting permission at the same time. "Adelaide," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I know we agreed to keep things businesslike between us, at least at first. But I find myself hoping for more than just a successful farm when I think about the future." Adelaide's heart raced at his words, but she didn't withdraw her hand. "What do you hope for then?" she asked, needing to hear him say it plainly. "A life shared," Miles answered, his gaze holding her steadily. "Work and rest, joy and hardship, all of it together, not just as business partners, but as more." "As husband and wife, you mean," Adelaide said, the directness she had always valued asserting itself even as her pulse quickened. Miles nodded, a smile touching the corners of his mouth at her forthrightness. "Yes, though I'm not formally asking yet," he added quickly. "It's too soon, and you deserve to be certain. We both do." Adelaide appreciated his restraint, his understanding that such decisions shouldn't be rushed. "How will we know when it's the right time?" she asked. Miles's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I think we'll just know," he said simply. "In the meantime, may I court you properly, Miss Porter?" "Sunday drives, socials in town when we can spare the time, perhaps even a dance or two at the Harvest Festival next month." The formal request, delivered with a hint of playfulness, made Adelaide smile. "I think I would like that very much, Mr. Vance," she replied, matching his tone. He raised her hand to his lips then, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent a shiver of anticipation through her entire body. "Then it's settled," he said softly. "Partners in all things, moving forward together at a pace that feels right for both of us." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Adelaide felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path ahead wasn't perfectly clear, and there would still be challenges to face. The farm's recovery was far from complete, and relationships, like crops, required constant tending to thrive. But for the first time in years, the future held more promise than peril. And the man sitting beside her, his hand still holding hers with gentle strength, had become the embodiment of that promise. Winter came early to Adelaide City that year, with the first snow falling before Thanksgiving. The farm, under Miles and Adelaide's joint care, had weathered the fall harvest better than Adelaide had dared to hope. The vegetable garden had yielded enough to preserve for the winter months, the chickens were laying well, and the winter wheat Miles had suggested for the south field was sprouting in neat, promising rows. Their courtship had progressed alongside their agricultural efforts, Sunday drives in the wagon Miles had repaired, occasional dinners at the hotel in town, and as he had promised, several dances at the Harvest Festival in November. Adelaide found herself looking forward to these outings with an eagerness that sometimes surprised her. After years of focusing solely on survival, the simple joy of being courted, of being admired and cared for, was a luxury she was slowly learning to embrace. The people of Adelaide City had accepted their arrangement with minimal gossip, particularly after Miles made a point of speaking with Pastor Williams about his intentions. The fact that they maintained separate residences, Miles still in the bunkhouse, despite the dropping temperatures, helped quell any potential scandal. On a particularly cold December evening, with snow falling steadily outside, Adelaide sat by the fire in the farmhouse parlor, mending one of Miles's shirts. He had gone into town earlier to pick up supplies and mail, and she expected him back soon, weather permitting. The sound of the front door opening and Miles stamping snow from his boots brought a smile to her face. "In here," she called, setting aside her mending. Miles appeared in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders and hat, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "It's really coming down out there," he said, removing his hat and coat. "Might be snowed in by morning if it keeps up." "Did you get everything we needed?" Adelaide asked, rising to help him with his things. Miles nodded, producing a small stack of mail from his coat pocket. "And these came for you. One looks like it might be from California." Adelaide took the letters with surprise. "California? I don't know anyone in, unless—" Her heart quickened as she examined the return address. "It's from James, my brother." Miles's expression sobered. Do you want me to give you some privacy to read it? Adelaide hesitated, then shook her head. No, whatever he has to say, I'd rather not face it alone. Miles moved to the fire, warming his hands as Adelaide opened the letter with slightly trembling fingers. She hadn't heard from her brother in over 2 years, not since he had left for California with his share of their parents' meager savings, promising to send for her once he was established. That promise, like so many others, had gone unfulfilled. Dear Adelaide, she read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. I hope this letter finds you well. I apologize for the long silence. Life in California has not been what I expected. She paused, glancing at Miles, who had taken a seat in the chair opposite hers, his expression attentive but neutral, allowing her to process her brother's words without influence. I have been working in the shipyards in San Francisco, Adelaide continued reading. The pay is decent, but the cost of living is high. I've only recently been able to save enough to consider my future with any certainty. I've been thinking about the farm, about Mom and Dad, about you alone there trying to keep everything together. I was selfish to leave you with that burden. The war changed me, as it changed many men, but that's no excuse for abandoning my responsibility to our family. I'm considering returning to Idaho in the spring if you would welcome me. Not to take over, I know the farm is yours now, but to help, to make amends if possible. Please write and let me know your thoughts on this. Your brother, James. Adelaide lowered the letter to her lap, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her relief that James was alive and well, anger at his long silence, uncertainty about what his potential return might mean for the life she and Miles were building. What are you thinking? Miles asked gently after a moment of silence. Adelaide looked up at him, grateful for his calm presence. I'm not sure, she admitted. Part of me is happy he's safe, that he's thinking of the farm again. Another part is wary, Miles finished for her. After he left you to manage everything alone for so long, Adelaide nodded, and theirs also. She hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. I'm wondering what his return would mean for us, for our partnership, both business and personal. Miles leaned forward, his expression earnest. Adelaide, nothing changes the agreement we've made, not unless you want it to. Your brother's return, if it happens, doesn't alter what's between us. But the farm would be different, Adelaide pointed out. 3 people instead of 2. A brother who might feel he has some claim, despite what he says in the letter. Miles considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it, he said finally. For now, it's just a possibility, not a certainty, and whatever happens, we'll face it together. The simple assurance eased some of Adelaide's anxiety. Together, she repeated softly. Miles rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. I've been waiting for the right moment, he said, his voice low and fervent. I thought perhaps Christmas or New Year's. But seeing you read that letter, watching you process news that could change everything, it reminds me that life doesn't always allow for perfect timing. Adelaide's breath caught as she realized what was happening. Miles. Adelaide Porter, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. These past months working beside you, courting you, learning who you are in all weather and circumstances, they've been the happiest of my life. I know who you are now, your strength, your determination, your capacity for love despite hardship. And I know with absolute certainty that I want to spend the rest of my days as your partner in all things. He reached into his pocket and produced a small ring, a simple gold band with a single pearl set in its center. This was my mother's, he said softly. My father gave it to her when they had nothing but hopes and dreams for their future. I'd be honored if you would wear it, if you would consent to be my wife. Adelaide felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. The timing might not have been what either of them had planned, but Miles was right, it felt perfect in its own way, this proposal coming at a moment when they were both reminded that life could change in an instant. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain despite the tears. Yes, I will marry you, Miles Vance. His face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit almost perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. Miles rose from his kneeling position to gather her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, Adelaide rested her forehead against his, overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. "When?" she asked simply. "Spring," Miles suggested. "After the worst of winter is past, before the busiest part of the planting season begins. And," he added with gentle practicality, "it would give us time to prepare if your brother does decide to return." Adelaide nodded, appreciating as always his thoughtful consideration of all aspects of their shared life. "Spring sounds perfect." They sat together by the fire as the snow continued to fall outside, discussing plans for their wedding and the future beyond it. James's letter lay on the side table, not forgotten but no longer the center of their attention. Whatever challenges his potential return might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else since that fateful day by the well together, with strength drawn from their growing love. Later that night, as Miles prepared to brave the snow for the short walk back to the bunkhouse, Adelaide stood with him at the door, reluctant to see him go despite the propriety that still governed their relationship until marriage. "It won't be long now," Miles said, understanding her unspoken thought. "A few more months of goodnight kisses at the door and then we'll have a lifetime of good nights together," Adelaide finished for him, rising on tiptoes to press a final kiss to his lips. As she watched him disappear into the swirling snow, Adelaide touched the pearl ring on her finger, its weight unfamiliar but welcome. From the moment of her collapse at the well to this night of her engagement, the journey had been unexpected in every way. Miles had carried her water that day, but in the months since, he had helped her bear burdens far heavier: the struggle to save her farm, the loneliness of facing an uncertain future, the weight of responsibilities that had once seemed overwhelming. Now, as the snow blanketed the world outside in pristine white, Adelaide felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever tomorrow might bring: spring planting, a wedding, perhaps even her brother's return, she would no longer face it alone. And in that knowledge, she found a joy deeper than any she had known before. Spring arrived in Malad City with its usual capriciousness: warm, promising days followed by sudden frosts, gentle rains interspersed with the last reluctant snows of winter. By April, however, the land had fully awakened, with new grass carpeting the fields and buds appearing on the trees lining the farm's long driveway. Adelaide stood at her bedroom window, watching as Miles worked in the south field, the winter wheat now tall and green, soon to be plowed under as he had planned to enrich the soil. The past months had been busy ones: preparations for their wedding, continued improvements to the farm, and correspondence with James, who had indeed confirmed his intention to return to Idaho. According to his letters, James would arrive in Malad City in late May after Adelaide and Miles's wedding, which was scheduled for the last Saturday in April. Adelaide wasn't sure if the timing was coincidence or deliberate on her brother's part, but she was grateful for it either way. She wanted to be established as Miles's wife before facing whatever complications James's return might bring. A knock at the front door drew Adelaide from her reverie. Setting aside the wedding dress she had been altering, her mother's gown, carefully preserved all these years, she made her way downstairs. Mrs. Whitaker, their elderly neighbor, stood on the porch, a covered basket in her hands. "Good morning, Adelaide dear," she said with a warm smile. "I've brought those seedlings I promised for your garden and some of my sourdough bread fresh from the oven." "You're too kind," Adelaide said, ushering the older woman inside. "Let me make you some tea," as they sat at the kitchen table, enjoying tea and still warm bread. Mrs. Whitaker's gaze fell on the preparations evident around the room: jars of preserved fruits set aside for the wedding reception, bundles of dried herbs hanging to be used in the wedding feast, a list of tasks pinned to the wall. "Only a week to go," the older woman observed with a knowing smile. "Are you nervous, my dear?" Adelaide considered the question honestly. "Not about marrying Miles," she said. That feels right in a way few things have in my life, but there are other complications. Mrs. Whittaker nodded sagely. Your brother's return, I'd imagine. News traveled quickly in small communities, and James's impending arrival had been a topic of speculation since his first letter. Some in town remembered him fondly from before the war. Others recalled the changed man who had left his sister to manage alone after their parents' deaths. Yes, Adelaide acknowledged. I'm not sure what to expect. His letters seem sincere, but words on paper are one thing, actions another, Mrs. Whittaker finished for her. She reached across the table to pat Adelaide's hand. Have faith, my dear. The James who left was a wounded soul trying to outrun his pain. Perhaps time and distance have helped him heal. Adelaide smiled gratefully at the older woman's wisdom. Mrs. Whittaker had been a constant support through the hardest years after her parents' deaths, offering practical help and emotional comfort without judgment. Miles says much the same thing, Adelaide admitted. He believes people can change, can find their way back to who they truly are after losing themselves for a time. Your Miles is a wise man, Mrs. Whittaker said approvingly, and he loves you deeply. Anyone with eyes can see that. A warm flush crept into Adelaide's cheeks at the simple truth of the statement. Miles's love was evident in everything he did, from the major efforts like deepening the well and repairing the barn to the small daily kindnesses that showed his thoughtfulness. Just that morning she had found a bunch of early wildflowers on the porch steps, gathered from the meadow beyond the south field. I'm very fortunate, she said softly. As is he, Mrs. Whittaker replied firmly. Never forget that, my dear. You bring as much to this marriage as he does your strength, your perseverance, this home you fought so hard to keep. She rose from the table, gathering her empty basket. Now I should be going. There's much to do before the wedding, and I've kept you from your preparations long enough. Adelaide walked the older woman to the door, accepting her parting embrace with genuine affection. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Whittaker. We would be honored if you would sit with my side of the family at the ceremony. Mrs. Whittaker's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I would be honored, my dear, truly honored. After her visitor's departure, Adelaide returned to her sewing, her thoughts now turned more fully to the approaching ceremony. Pastor Williams would perform the service in the small white church in town where she had been baptized as an infant and where she had said goodbye to her parents 3 years ago. The reception would follow here at the farm, with the entire community invited to celebrate. It would be a simple affair by some standards. Adelaide had neither the resources nor the inclination for ostentation, but meaningful in all the ways that mattered. The food would be abundant, prepared by Adelaide with help from the women of the church. Music would be provided by the same cowboys who had played at the Broken Spur after the roundup, now friends who had offered their talents as a wedding gift. And at the center of it all, the promise between her and Miles to share a life, to nurture this land, to face whatever came their way with the same partnership that had begun that day by the well. The sound of boots on the porch alerted Adelaide to Miles's return from the fields. Setting aside her sewing once more, she went to greet him, her heart lifting at the sight of his smile when she opened the door. The south field is coming along beautifully, he reported, removing his hat as he stepped inside. By next planting season, it'll be ready to produce a crop to rival any in the county. Adelaide filled a cup with cool water from the pitcher on the sideboard and handed it to him. Mrs. Whittaker brought the seedlings for the garden, she said, and fresh bread. Miles accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply before responding. That woman is a treasure. How are the wedding preparations coming along? On schedule, Adelaide assured him. I've nearly finished altering my mother's dress. Pastor Williams confirmed the time. The only thing left is to finalize the guest list and make sure we have enough food prepared. Miles set down his cup and drew her into his arms, seemingly unconcerned about the dust from the fields that still clung to his clothing. 1 week, he murmured against her hair. 1 week and you'll be Mrs. Vance. Adelaide leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him, the sense of safety she felt in his arms. "It can't come soon enough," she admitted. Miles chuckled, the sound reverberating through his chest against her ear. "Careful, Miss Porter. Such impatience might give a man ideas." Adelaide tilted her face up to his, her expression mock-serious. "Perhaps that's my intention, Mr. Vance." His kiss was tender but held a promise of deeper passion, carefully restrained until their vows were spoken. When they parted, his eyes were dark with emotions that sent a thrill through Adelaide's entire body. "1 week," he repeated, his voice slightly husky. "Just 1 more week." The final days before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Friends and neighbors came to help with last-minute preparations, setting up tables and benches in the yard for the reception, decorating the house and barn with spring flowers and ribbons, bringing food and offers of assistance. Samuel Taylor arrived from the Broken Spur with a wagon loaded with gifts, a fine heifer for their small herd, new tools for the farm, and a beautiful handcrafted rocking chair that he announced was from Mrs. Finley, who sent her regrets that she couldn't attend in person. "She said every farmhouse needs a proper rocking chair," Taylor explained gruffly, though his eyes twinkled with affection for his cook's sentiment. "For quiet evenings and future little ones." The reference to children, a natural assumption, but one that Adelaide and Miles had discussed only in the most general terms, brought a blush to Adelaide's cheeks, but a smile to her lips. The thought of expanding their family, of filling the farmhouse with new life and laughter, was one that had begun to take root in her heart as their wedding day approached. On the eve of the ceremony, tradition dictated that Miles should spend the night away from the farm, so Adelaide found herself alone in the house for the first time in months. He had gone to stay with Frank Thompson, who had come from the Broken Spur to stand as Miles's best man at the wedding. The solitude gave Adelaide time to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She walked through the rooms of her family home, soon to be her marital home, as well, touching familiar objects, remembering the past while anticipating the future. In her parents' bedroom, unused since their deaths, but kept clean and ready, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, lifting out her mother's wedding dress. The ivory satin had yellowed slightly with age, but Adelaide had carefully altered and refreshed it, adding touches of lace from her own mother's trousseau. Holding it against herself, she stood before the mirror, trying to imagine how she would look tomorrow as Miles's bride. Would her mother recognize her, she wondered. Would she approve of the man Adelaide had chosen, of the decisions she had made for the farm, of the life she was building from the ashes of loss? "I think she would," came a voice from the doorway. Adelaide whirled around, startled to find Mrs. Whittaker standing there, a gentle smile on her lined face. "I'm sorry to intrude," the older woman said. "The front door was ajar, and when you didn't answer my call, I grew concerned." Adelaide lowered the dress, embarrassed to be caught in such a sentimental moment. "It's all right, I was just wondering if your mother would approve," Mrs. Whittaker finished for her. "I knew Elizabeth Porter well, my dear. She would be proud of the woman you've become, and she would adore the man you've chosen." Tears welled in Adelaide's eyes at this affirmation of what she had hoped, but couldn't know for certain. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Whittaker moved further into the room, reaching out to touch the wedding dress with reverent fingers. "I remember when she wore this," she said softly. "She was radiant, just as you will be tomorrow." The older woman reached into her pocket and produced a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought you something, a wedding gift of sorts, though perhaps more alone." Adelaide set aside the dress carefully and accepted the package. Unwrapping it, she found a delicate lace handkerchief, yellowed with age but exquisitely preserved. "It was my grandmother's," Mrs. Whittaker explained. "I carried it at my wedding, as did my daughter at hers. Something old, something borrowed, it serves for both." Adelaide felt fresh tears threatening at this unexpected kindness. "I would be honored," she managed. Mrs. Whittaker embraced her warmly. "Get some rest, my dear. Tomorrow is a new beginning for you and Miles, and for this farm that has seen both joy and sorrow. I believe there is much more joy to come." After the older woman left, Adelaide carefully laid out everything for the morning: her dress, the pearl-embroidered slippers that had been her mother's, the handkerchief from Mrs. Whittaker. Her something new would be the pearl ring Miles had given her, now moved to her right hand to make way for the wedding band tomorrow. Something blue was a ribbon she had sewn into the hem of her dress, a piece of the dress she had worn the day Miles had found her at the well. Finally, exhausted but at peace, Adelaide slept her last night as a single woman in the room that had been hers since childhood. Tomorrow, she and Miles would begin their life together in the main bedroom, surrounded by the memories of those who had built this home, but looking forward to the future they would create together. The morning of Adelaide and Miles's wedding dawned clear and perfect, with spring sunshine warming the land, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of apple blossoms from the small orchard behind the house. Adelaide woke early, a mixture of excitement and serene certainty filling her heart as she prepared for the day ahead. Mrs. Whittaker arrived shortly after breakfast, along with several women from the church who had offered to help Adelaide dress and prepare the house for the reception to follow. They brought flowers freshly picked from their gardens, baskets of food for the celebration, and the cheerful bustle of women engaged in a joyful task. As the morning progressed, Adelaide allowed herself to be guided through the rituals of a bride's preparation, bathing in water scented with lavender, having her hair arranged in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers, and finally, stepping into her mother's wedding dress, now perfectly fitted to her own form. "Oh, Adelaide," breathed Sarah Johnson, the minister's wife, when the final buttons had been fastened. "You look absolutely beautiful." The other women murmured agreement, their eyes soft with emotion as Adelaide turned to view herself in the mirror. The ivory satin glowed against her skin, the alterations she had made giving the vintage gown a touch of modern elegance while honoring its history. "Your parents would be so proud," Mrs. Whittaker said, carefully arranging the simple veil over Adelaide's dark hair. "And that young man of yours won't know what hit him when he sees you walking down the aisle." Adelaide smiled, a blush coloring her cheeks at the thought of Miles's reaction. Despite their months of partnership and courtship, there was something profoundly different about today, about the public declaration they would make before God and their community, about the intimacy that would follow when they returned to the farm as husband and wife. The sound of wagons and horses arriving outside signaled that it was time to leave for the church. Mr. Johnson, the minister's husband, had offered to escort Adelaide in her parents' absence, a kindness that touched her deeply. As she prepared to depart, Adelaide took a final look around the bedroom that had been hers since childhood. The next time she returned to this house, it would be as a wife, beginning a new chapter in these familiar walls. The thought was both poignant and exhilarating. The small church in Malad City was filled to capacity when Adelaide arrived. It seemed that everyone in the community had turned out to witness the union of Adelaide Porter and Miles Vance, a testament to the respect both had earned through their hard work and integrity. Standing at the back of the church, her arm linked with Mr. Johnson's, Adelaide took a deep breath as the first notes of music signaled her entrance. As the congregation rose and turned to watch her progress, her eyes sought and found Miles waiting for her at the altar. The expression on his face as he saw her for the first time in her wedding dress was everything Mrs. Whittaker had predicted, and more, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and profound love that made Adelaide's heart swell with answering emotion. In that moment, any lingering doubts she might have harbored about their future together vanished completely. Pastor Williams welcomed them with a warm smile as Adelaide joined Miles before the altar. The ceremony itself was traditional but personal, with readings chosen by the couple and vows they had written together, speaking of partnership, respect, and a love that had grown from friendship and shared purpose. When Miles placed the simple gold band on Adelaide's finger to join her mother's pearl ring, his hands were steady but his eyes glistened with emotion. Adelaide's own voice trembled slightly as she repeated her vows, the significance of the moment overwhelming in its beauty and solemnity. By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Idaho, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Williams declared, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. Miles, you may kiss your bride. Miles's kiss was gentle but fervent, a perfect balance of restraint appropriate to the setting and promise of what was to come. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Vance, for the first time, the church erupted in applause and cheers, the community's blessing surrounding them like a tangible embrace. The reception at the farm was everything Adelaide had hoped. It would be a joyful celebration of their union, with abundant food, music, dancing, and the warm fellowship of friends and neighbors. The yard had been transformed with tables laden with food, benches and chairs arranged for comfortable conversation, and lanterns hung from tree branches to provide light as the celebration continued into the evening. Miles rarely left Adelaide's side throughout the day, his hand often finding hers as they received congratulations and good wishes from their guests. There was a new dimension to his touch now, a sense of rightful possession, of belonging to each other in the eyes of God and their community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Samuel Taylor approached the couple with a knowing smile. "I believe it's time for the traditional departure of the bride and groom," he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Though in this case, they're not going far, just into that fine house to begin their life together properly." A chorus of good-natured laughter and cheers followed his words. It was indeed tradition for wedding guests to continue the celebration long after the couple had left, often until the early hours of the morning. Miles looked at Adelaide questioningly, leaving the decision to her. With a smile and a slight nod, she signaled her readiness to conclude their public role in the festivities. Hand in hand, they made their way through the crowd of well-wishers, accepting final congratulations and enduring the traditional teasing with good humor. At the porch steps, Miles paused, and before Adelaide could react, he had swept her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a grin as he carried her across the threshold into their home, the cheers of their guests following them inside. Once the door closed behind them, the sounds of the ongoing celebration became muffled and distant. Miles set Adelaide gently on her feet in the entryway of what was now truly their home, his expression suddenly serious. "Mrs. Vance," he said softly, the new name sending a thrill through Adelaide's heart. "We did it." Adelaide reached up to touch his face, the face that had become so dear to her since that day by the well. "We did," she agreed, "and now we begin." Miles's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Now we begin," he echoed, lowering his head to claim her lips in a kiss that held all the passion they had carefully restrained until this moment. As the celebration continued outside and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Adelaide and Miles began their life together as husband and wife, their love a testament to the strength that can emerge from vulnerability, the partnership that can grow from a moment of need, and the future that can be built when burdens are carried together. 3 weeks after the wedding, Adelaide stood on the porch of the farmhouse, shading her eyes against the late May sunshine as she watched a wagon approaching down the long drive. Miles paused in his work on the fence nearby, following her gaze. "It's him," Adelaide said quietly, recognizing the figure driving the wagon even at a distance. "James." Miles set down his tools and moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in a gesture of support that had become second nature. "Ready?" he asked simply. Adelaide nodded, though uncertainty fluttered in her stomach. Despite the regular correspondence of the past months, she wasn't sure what to expect from this reunion with her brother. The James who was approaching was both familiar and a stranger, the boy she had grown up with, the traumatized young man who had abandoned her after their parents' deaths. And now, perhaps, someone new entirely. As the wagon drew closer, Adelaide could make out more details. James's hair was longer than she remembered, his face more weathered by sun and experience, but his posture as he handled the reins was unmistakably that of her brother. The wagon came to a stop in the yard, and for a moment, James simply sat looking at the house, at Adelaide and Miles on the porch. Then, with a visible breath, he climbed down and approached. "Adelaide," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, his eyes taking in the changes to the farm before returning to her face. You look happy." It wasn't what she had expected him to say, but the simple observation broke through some of the tension that had been building within her. "I am happy, James," she replied honestly. Her brother nodded, then turned his attention to Miles, extending his hand. "You must be Miles Vance. My sister's letters have spoken highly of you." Miles shook his hand firmly. "Welcome to our home, James. Adelaide has been looking forward to your visit." The careful neutrality of Miles's words wasn't lost on James, who acknowledged it with a slight nod. "I appreciate the welcome, especially given the circumstances of my departure." Adelaide stepped forward then, bridging the space between them. "Come inside, James. You must be tired after your journey. We can talk over a meal." The next few hours passed in a careful dance of reacquaintance. Over Adelaide's cooking, James shared stories of his time in California, the initial struggles to find work, the eventual position in the shipyards, the gradual healing that had come with distance and time. "The war left me broken in ways I couldn't name," he admitted as they sat around the kitchen table, coffee cups before them. "When mother and father died so suddenly, it was like the last anchor holding me to sanity had been cut loose. I couldn't see a future here, couldn't imagine rebuilding what had been lost." He looked directly at Adelaide, remorse evident in his eyes. "I should never have left you to bear that burden alone. It was unforgivable." Adelaide felt Miles's steady presence beside her, drawing strength from his quiet support. "It was a difficult time for both of us," she said carefully. "We each coped in our own way." James's gaze shifted to include Miles. "And then you found someone who was willing to help carry the weight," he observed, no resentment in his tone, only a thoughtful assessment. "From what I gather from your letters, it was quite the meeting." Adelaide couldn't help the small smile that curved her lips at the memory. "I collapsed from exhaustion at the town well. Miles carried my water home along with me and stayed to help with the rest," James finished, nodding as if confirming something to himself. "I'm glad. The farm deserved better than I could give it then." He hesitated, then added, "than I could give you." The simple acknowledgement of his failure touched Adelaide more deeply than 1,000 apologies might have. "What are your plans now, James?" she asked, moving the conversation forward. "Your letters mentioned staying in Malad City, but were vague on the details." James set down his coffee cup, his expression becoming more businesslike. "I've saved enough to make a fresh start. I thought perhaps I might look for land nearby, not to compete with what you've built here, but to establish something of my own." He glanced around the kitchen, taking in the subtle changes Adelaide and Miles had made to the family home. "This place is yours now, yours and Miles's. I see that clearly." Adelaide exchanged a look with Miles, a silent communication passing between them. They had discussed this possibility before James's arrival, considering various ways they might incorporate him into their lives if he truly wished to remain in the area. "Actually," Miles said, speaking up for the first time in a while, "we've been considering expanding our operation. The South Field is coming back strong, as Adelaide may have mentioned in her letters, but there's only so much the two of us can manage on our own." James's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "What are you suggesting?" "A different kind of partnership," Adelaide explained. "Not ownership of the farm that remains with Miles and me, but cooperation. Your own place nearby, as you said, working together during planting and harvest, sharing resources and knowledge." "The Porter siblings and Vance," James said slowly, testing the concept. "Working together but maintaining separate households," Miles nodded. "Something like that. It would benefit us all, I think. More hands for the heavy work, more security against hard times." James was silent for a long moment, considering. "It's more than I expected," he admitted finally. "More than I deserve after how I left." "It's not about deserving," Adelaide said gently. "It's about family, about building something together for the future." She reached across the table, offering her hand to her brother. If you're ready to be part of that, we'd welcome it. James took her hand, his own calloused from years of hard labor in the shipyards. I am ready, he said, his voice thick with emotion. More than ready. Later that evening, after James had gone to settle in the bunkhouse that had been Miles's residence before their marriage, Adelaide and Miles sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. That went better than I feared, Adelaide admitted, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. Miles's arm tightened around her waist. He's changed, he observed. There's a steadiness to him now that comes from facing one's demons and making peace with them. Adelaide nodded, thinking of the brother she had known before the war, the troubled young man who had fled after their parents' deaths, and the more mature, thoughtful person who had returned. Do you think it will work, the arrangement we proposed? Miles was quiet for a moment, considering the question with his usual thoroughness. I think it has every chance of success, he said finally. He seems sincere in his desire to make amends, to build something new. And having another set of hands will allow us to expand in ways we couldn't manage on our own. The us and we still sent a warm glow through Adelaide's heart whenever Miles used them, a constant reminder of the partnership they had forged, first in business and now in marriage. Our children will have an uncle nearby, she said softly, voicing a thought that had been growing in her mind lately. Miles's hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach, a question in his touch. Adelaide covered his hand with her own, a smile curving her lips. Not yet, she assured him. But someday soon, perhaps, I'd like that. Miles turned to her, his expression softening with love and a touch of wonder at the future they were planning together. So would I, he said, leaning in to kiss her gently. A home filled with children, the land producing bountifully. Your brother settled nearby, it's a good vision for our future, Adelaide. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Adelaide reflected on how far she had come since that desperate day at the well. From exhaustion and the verge of defeat to this moment of peace and possibility, it was a journey she could scarcely have imagined when she had collapsed under the weight of her burdens. Yet here she was, those burdens now shared, her heart full, her future secure in the love of the man beside her and the promise of the life they were building together. The well that had been the site of her lowest moment had also been the beginning of her greatest blessing, a reminder that sometimes it is only when we reach the end of our own strength that we find the hand extended to help us carry on. As Miles's arm drew her closer in the gathering darkness, Adelaide gave thanks for that moment of weakness that had led to such strength, for the stranger who had become her partner in all things, and for the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might hold, she would face them not alone, but hand in hand with the man who had first carried her water and her burdens home.